The studio lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and millions of viewers were watching from around the world. It was supposed to be just another political debate, loud voices interrupting each other, each guest trying to sound smarter and stronger than the last. But no one expected this moment to happen, the moment when one man's calm faith would silence an entire stage. Charlie Kirk sat confidently in his chair, leaning back like he already owned the conversation. He spoke fast, loud, and sharp, slicing through every topic with the same aggressive style his audience knew well. He was ready to challenge anyone, ready to embarrass anyone, ready to win every argument before it even began. And sitting right across from him was Jonathan Roumie, quiet, composed, hands folded, eyes steady. No flashy suit, no dramatic gestures, no attempt to overpower the room. Just presence. Just calm. He looked like the one person who didn't come to fight, but came to stand for something deeper. Then it happened. Charlie leaned forward, pointed his finger slightly, and said with a smirk that the cameras captured perfectly. "So, Jonathan, do you really believe all that religious stuff you talk about? Or is it just an act for your fans?" The audience gasped. Some laughed. Some leaned closer, waiting for drama. Others pulled out their phones, sensing a viral moment. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He didn't show a single sign of discomfort. But his silence spoke louder than anything. Charlie saw that Jonathan wasn't shaken, and that bothered him. So he pushed harder. He mocked faith. He mocked belief. He even mocked Jonathan's acting roles, suggesting he only pretends to be spiritual. People in the studio began to whisper. The host's eyes shifted nervously. The atmosphere tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. Charlie's intention was clear: humiliate him on live TV, break his calm, force him into an emotional reaction that would make for great ratings. But Jonathan simply breathed in, breathed out, and lifted his head slowly. And in that moment, before he even spoke, the entire room sensed it. Something powerful was coming. Something Charlie Kirk was not prepared for. Because sometimes, the calmest voice delivers the loudest truth. The studio of Nation Point Live was buzzing long before the cameras switched on. Assistants hurried back and forth, fixing microphones, adjusting lights, handing out cue cards. Producers whispered instructions into headsets. The room felt electric, charged with the anticipation of a heated discussion, the kind of show that pulled in millions because people loved watching opinions collide. Charlie Kirk arrived like a storm. His team walked in first, setting the tone. Then Charlie followed, fast steps, squared shoulders, a confident smirk on his face that said he was ready to dominate the stage. He greeted the crew with short nods, not slowing down for anyone. He loosened his tie, adjusted his earpiece, and scanned the room as if he owned the place. This was his arena. And he knew it. Charlie Kirk had built a reputation. Sharp, bold, confrontational. He didn't avoid controversy. He stepped directly into it. To him, debates were battles, and he was the loudest, quickest sword in the fight. Tonight, he believed, would be no different. Across the set, Jonathan Roumie entered with a completely different energy. Where Charlie's arrival felt like thunder, Jonathan's felt like a quiet sunrise, soft, calm, steady. He clasped hands with crew members as they greeted him warmly. "Thank you," he whispered each time someone adjusted his mic or offered him water. There was no rush in his movements. No ego floating around him. Just gentleness that stood out sharply against the tension in the room. Jonathan took his seat on the panel table, smiling politely, his posture relaxed. He wasn't a political fighter, and everyone knew it. He wasn't there to debate policy or tear someone down. He was invited because of his influence, his role portraying Jesus, and the message of compassion he often spoke about. Some questioned why he agreed to appear. Stepping into a show known for verbal combat wasn't his natural environment. But Jonathan believed in conversations, even difficult ones. A junior producer approached him with a nervous smile. "Mr. Roumie, are you comfortable? If the conversation gets too intense, we can cut to a break." Jonathan smiled back. "I'll be okay. Thank you." Meanwhile, Charlie watched him from the other side of the set. To Charlie, Jonathan's calmness looked like weakness. His quiet posture looked like vulnerability, something easy to overpower. He nudged one of his team members and whispered, loud enough for a nearby mic to catch faintly, "This'll be an easy night." Cameras were tested. Microphones checked. The host, a charismatic man with silver hair and practiced charm, rehearsed his intro under his breath. 5 minutes to live broadcast. The audience filed in and took their seats. Some recognized Jonathan immediately and waved, excited. Others came specifically for Charlie's explosive commentary. The mixed energy created a strange tension, admiration on one side, anticipation for confrontation on the other. Jonathan folded his hands. Charlie cracked his knuckles. The host walked to center stage. "All right, everyone, places." A floor manager held up her hand. "Going live in 5, 4, 3, 2. And as the final finger went down, the theme music played. The bright studio lights flicked fully on, illuminating the set with intensity. The cameras glided into position like silent predators prepared to capture every expression, every tremor, every moment worth replaying. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," the host began confidently. "Tonight, we have a powerful discussion ahead: culture, belief, society, and the values shaping the next generation. And joining us today is Charlie Kirk, and actor and humanitarian, Jonathan Roumie." Applause filled the room, polite but mixed. Charlie lifted his chin proudly. Jonathan nodded gently. The host continued, moving from topic to topic, letting the panelists speak. Charlie was in his element. He interrupted, challenged, fired sharp questions, and leaned forward with bold gestures that filled the screen. Every time he spoke, he sounded sure, almost aggressively sure. Jonathan, on the other hand, listened more than he spoke. When he did answer, he chose his words carefully, thoughtful, heartfelt, never trying to win. His tone wasn't dramatic. He simply shared what he believed: kindness, empathy, humility. And the more calmly Jonathan spoke, the more Charlie became irritated. It wasn't obvious at first, just a tightening jaw, a narrowed expression, a shift in posture. Charlie wasn't used to opponents who didn't fight back. He wasn't used to someone who didn't try to match his volume or speak over him. Jonathan's quietness felt like resistance in a different form, a kind that Charlie could not break with his usual tactics. Finally, during a segment on personal belief, the tension snapped. Charlie leaned forward, voice louder than before, eyes locked on Jonathan. "So, Jonathan," he said with a mocking smile, "tell us, do you actually believe all that religious stuff? Or is it just a performance for your fans?" Gasps. Whispers. Even the host looked shocked. Jonathan didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't shift. He simply looked at Charlie with a calmness that felt almost supernatural. The air tightened. The room froze. Everyone sensed it. The studio had never been this silent. Charlie Kirk's question still hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite something explosive. "Do you actually believe all that religious stuff? Or is it just a performance for your fans?" The live audience froze. Even people watching behind the cameras stared wide-eyed, shocked not just by the question, but by the way it was delivered. Sharp, mocking, dripping with sarcasm. Jonathan Roumie didn't respond immediately. He simply breathed, slow and steady, as if giving his heart a moment to settle before speaking. But Charlie mistook that silence. To him, silence meant weakness, hesitation, a target too soft to fight back. So he pressed harder. "You act like some holy figure," Charlie continued, leaning forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, voice rising. "But here's the truth: actors act. That's what you do. So be honest with America right now. All that faith stuff, is it just marketing?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the studio audience. The host attempted to intervene. "Charlie, let's keep it respectful." Charlie cut him off with a dismissive wave. "No, people want answers. They want the truth. And I'm asking him directly." Jonathan still didn't rise to the bait. His expression didn't harden. His posture didn't change. He sat with the same calm presence, hands still gently folded. But inside the control room, the producers stared at each other nervously. They knew this moment would blow up online, clips would spread, hashtags would trend, and opinions would erupt from every corner. Nothing in the script predicted this confrontation, yet here it was, burning hotter with every second. Charlie wasn't finished. "You talk about compassion," he said, voice sharpening, But compassion doesn't fix society. Faith doesn't fix real problems. We need logic, strength, solutions, not sermons. He laughed lightly, glancing at the audience for approval. Some chuckled with him. Others looked uncomfortable. Many watched Jonathan, waiting for him to snap back or defend himself. But he didn't. And that irritated Charlie even more. "You see," Charlie said, gesturing toward Jonathan. "This is what I mean. Quiet. Passive. Avoiding real questions. People like you hide behind spirituality because you can't handle real confrontation." The audience gasped softly. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was an attack. Jonathan exhaled, a deep, steadying breath that seemed to ground the entire room. And the way he lifted his eyes, slowly, calmly, made something shift. Not in Charlie. Not yet. But in the people watching. Jonathan finally spoke. Not loudly. Not defensively. Just honestly. But before he could finish his first sentence, Charlie interrupted again. "Don't give us vague actor talk," he snapped. "Answer the question. Do you really believe it?" A woman in the audience whispered loudly, "Let him speak." Someone else tapped their shoe nervously. Even the host looked frustrated, glancing at the producers to signal a possible cut to commercial. But Jonathan raised a hand gently, not high, not forcefully, just enough to signal that he would speak when the time was right. Charlie scoffed. "See, this is what happens when I ask hard questions. People like him shut down." Jonathan turned his head slightly, looking Charlie directly in the eyes, and for the first time that evening, Charlie shifted in his seat. Because Jonathan's gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was honest, clear, unshaken. "I'm not shutting down," Jonathan finally said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm choosing not to react out of ego." That one line struck the room like quiet lightning. Charlie blinked. It wasn't the reaction he expected. He looked momentarily thrown off, just a flicker, but enough for the audience to notice. Jonathan continued. "You're challenging my faith, not because you want an answer, but because you want a reaction." The audience murmured again. Charlie opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately. Jonathan gently placed his hands on the table. "My faith isn't a performance. It isn't a brand. It isn't something I switch on for cameras and off when they stop rolling. It's my compass, the thing that guides how I treat people, even people who don't treat me kindly." The camera slowly zoomed in on his face, calm, sincere, grounded. "But," Jonathan said, turning slightly, "if you think mocking my belief will shake me, it won't. Faith isn't fragile. It doesn't break under pressure. It gets revealed under pressure." There was a stillness now, the kind that comes before applause, before shock, before something shifts in the atmosphere. Charlie swallowed, visibly thrown off balance, but forced himself to speak again. "Well, that's—" He stopped. Words failed him for the first time that night. Jonathan wasn't done. "And if faith bothers you," he said, "maybe it's because deep down, you're looking for something you haven't found yet." The studio collectively inhaled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a clapback. It was truth, delivered gently, but with more weight than any argument Charlie had thrown. And for the first time, Charlie Kirk had no comeback. Jonathan's final sentence, "Maybe it's because you're looking for something you haven't found yet," echoed through the room like a slow-moving wave. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't mocking. It was calm. It was gentle. But somehow, it hit harder than any insult ever could. Charlie Kirk stared at him, lips parted slightly, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't how confrontations with him usually went. People argued. People shouted. People defended themselves fiercely. But Jonathan, he answered with something deeper than anger. Something Charlie wasn't used to facing, truth without hostility. The audience didn't breathe. Cameras zoomed in slowly, capturing Charlie's stunned expression and Jonathan's serene face side by side, a contrast so powerful it would soon flood social media. The host cleared his throat awkwardly, tapping his cue cards as if to break the tension. But even he felt the heaviness of the moment. He scanned the room, uncertain of what to say, what to ask, or whether he should even speak. Finally, the host whispered, "Well, that was..." But his words were drowned out by a sudden ripple from the audience. A woman in the second row placed her hand over her mouth. A man whispered to his wife, "Did you hear that? Wow." One teenager muttered, "He just humbled him without even trying." Someone else added quietly, "That wasn't an answer. That was a lesson." Charlie looked around, realizing the room was slipping out of his control. His confidence, once towering, now felt strangely small. He forced a laugh, a thin, shaky one, trying to act unfazed. "All right, well, that's your view," he said, waving a dismissive hand that didn't quite hide his discomfort. "Nice speech. Very poetic." But the tone didn't land. It didn't restore his dominance. It didn't erase what had just happened. In fact, it only made his discomfort more obvious. Jonathan didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't add anything. He simply let the silence do the talking. A silence that said, "You don't need to win an argument to win respect." Behind the cameras, the producers exchanged looks. One mouthed, "This is going viral." Another whispered into his headset, "Clip this entire segment. All angles. This will break the internet." The host tried to regain control of the show. "Let's move to the next topic," he said, shuffling his papers with trembling fingers. "We have a lot to cover tonight." But the atmosphere wouldn't reset. It couldn't. Something had changed. Charlie tried to speak again, wanting to pivot to a new argument, but the pressure in the room pressed against him. The words he normally delivered with such force came out weaker, less certain. "So, topic 2 is..." He hesitated. Never happened before. Charlie Kirk never hesitated. Jonathan, sensing the tension, leaned slightly toward the host. "If it's all right," he said softly, "I'd like to finish what I was saying earlier." The host nodded quickly, relieved someone was taking control. Charlie's eyebrows shot up, surprised, maybe even threatened, but he said nothing. Jonathan continued. "Faith isn't something I impose on others," he said. "It isn't something I use to feel superior. It's something I live with quietly, because it shapes how I treat people, even those who challenge me." His voice was gentle, but strong enough to cut through the entire studio. "That's why I'm not reacting to the mockery," he added. "Because I don't believe in returning negativity with negativity. That cycle never ends. Someone has to choose peace first." More murmurs from the crowd. People leaned in, captivated. A young man whispered, "He's not talking to Charlie anymore. He's talking to everyone." Jonathan's eyes softened, and without turning toward Charlie directly, he added, "And if someone feels the need to attack what another person believes, maybe it's because they're wrestling with something inside themselves. That deserves compassion, not anger." Charlie flinched slightly, not in pain, but in realization. Jonathan wasn't destroying him. He was understanding him. And that felt far more intense than any verbal blow. One person in the audience began to clap quietly, just one. Then another joined. Then a third. Soon, half the room was applauding. Not loudly. Not wildly. But respectfully, the kind of applause that comes when people witness something genuine. Charlie looked around, unable to hide his frustration. This wasn't the reaction he wanted. This wasn't the power dynamic he expected. Jonathan, however, nodded humbly, almost embarrassed by the attention. He wasn't performing. He wasn't lecturing. He was simply being human. And that humanity had just shifted the entire room. By the time the applause faded, Charlie Kirk knew the truth, whether he admitted it or not. He hadn't just lost a debate. He had been humbled by someone who never even tried to fight him. The applause faded slowly, like a wave returning to the ocean, but the energy it left behind still vibrated in the air. The studio felt different now, lighter for some, heavier for others. And no one felt that weight more than Charlie Kirk, who sat stiffly in his chair, jaw tight, eyes bouncing around the room in search of a reaction that would validate him. But the room wasn't with him. It was with Jonathan. The host shifted his cue cards nervously, trying to gather himself. "Hey, all right," he stammered. Let's move forward." But even he knew the show had changed direction. This wasn't just a panel discussion anymore. It had become a moment. And moments like this don't go away quietly. Charlie leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms in a defensive pose he didn't realize he'd taken. He looked like a man trying to rebuild a wall that had been knocked down in front of millions of viewers. He forced a smile. Well, that's touching and everything, but people watching at home don't want sermons. They want facts. The words came out sharp, but empty. It was the tone of a man trying to regain footing on ground that was no longer beneath him. Jonathan didn't respond. He simply looked at him with a kindness that made Charlie more uncomfortable than any criticism could have. The host cleared his throat again. Charlie, Jonathan, let's shift to a broader conversation. We're discussing belief, courage, values. But before he could continue, a voice from the audience rose clearly. Let him speak. Everyone turned. It was the same young woman who had earlier asked Charlie to let Jonathan talk. She stood up now, hands shaking slightly but voice steady. Jonathan wasn't preaching. He was answering. And he did it with more respect than he was given. A murmur spread across the audience. Several nodded. Someone clapped once. Another said, "Exactly." Charlie stared at her, stunned. He wasn't used to losing the room, especially not to someone who had barely raised his voice. The host tried to control the moment, motioning for calm. "All right, everyone, please." Jonathan gently lifted his hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "She's right." The room quieted again. Jonathan turned back toward the panel table. "If I may," he said, "I want to share something that might explain why I answered the way I did." Even Charlie looked up now, curiosity slipping through his irritation. Jonathan continued. "You asked if I really believe what I say," he said calmly. "And the answer is yes. Not because it's convenient. Not because people expect it. But because faith saved my life." A hush fell over the studio. Jonathan's voice remained even, but it carried a weight that pulled everyone closer. "There was a time," he said, fingers lightly tapping the table, "when I felt lost. I had no direction, no purpose. My career was falling apart. Doors were closing everywhere. And I kept asking myself, why am I even here?" Charlie blinked at him, the aggression on his face slowly dissolving into something else, confusion, maybe even recognition. "I wasn't doing well financially," Jonathan continued. "I was discouraged. I was tired. I was alone." He drew a soft breath. "And then, one night, out of desperation, I prayed. Not a rehearsed prayer, not a religious performance. Just a simple plea, if you're real, please show me." The room felt frozen. Even the crew members behind the cameras stopped moving. "And the next day," Jonathan said with a small smile, "I got a call. A role. An opportunity. A door I never expected to open." He looked down for a moment, as if reliving the memory. "That role changed my life. Not because it made me famous, but because it reminded me that I wasn't invisible. That someone, was listening." He looked at Charlie again. "So when I talk about faith, I'm not talking about religion as a debate point. I'm talking about the thing that pulled me out when nothing else could." Charlie's face softened, visibly, undeniably. Something in Jonathan's words had hit a place Charlie wasn't prepared to expose on live TV. Jonathan continued gently. "I know you don't believe the same things I do. And that's okay. I'm not here to convince you. I'm not here to win a debate. I'm here to be honest. If my answer made you uncomfortable, maybe it's because honesty hits us in places we don't expect." The audience absorbed every word. Jonathan rested his hands again. "And if you think faith makes me weak, then you've misunderstood what strength really looks like." Silence. Deep. Heavy. Real. Charlie swallowed hard, eyes locked on Jonathan, struggling to respond. Not with anger. Not with sarcasm. But with something unfamiliar, humility trying to break through pride. The reveal wasn't Jonathan's story. It wasn't his pain. It wasn't his journey. The real reveal was this. Charlie Kirk, for the first time in a long time, was seeing a version of strength he couldn't talk over, laugh at, or diminish. Strength rooted in truth. Strength without ego. Strength he didn't know how to fight. Charlie Kirk sat there, staring at Jonathan as if seeing him for the very first time. Not the actor. Not the public figure. But the man, the human being beneath the spotlight. The studio lights glowed softly now, no longer harsh or competitive. Even the hum of the equipment seemed quieter, as if the entire room was listening to something deeper than words. Jonathan had just shared a story that stripped away every layer of pretense, every layer of showmanship. And in doing so, he had unintentionally stripped away Charlie's armor too. The walls Charlie had built, the bravado, the certainty, the sharpness, had cracks in them now, thin but unmistakable. The host shifted in his seat, tempted to move on, but held back. He sensed a moment unfolding that didn't need interruption. This wasn't television anymore. This was human. Charlie finally spoke, but his voice wasn't the same. "So, faith helped you?" he asked, not mocking, not sarcastic, just confused. Quiet. Human. Jonathan nodded. "Yes. It helped me find myself again." Charlie looked down at his hands, turning his ring around his finger, something he only did when he was uneasy. "I didn't know that," he muttered. "You weren't supposed to," Jonathan replied gently. "Most people carry battles no one sees. That's why compassion matters. You never know what someone is fighting." The audience felt that line. Someone whispered, "Wow." Someone else wiped their eyes. Charlie opened his mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. Instead, he sighed, a long, heavy sigh that carried years of tension. "I guess I've always seen faith as weakness," he said slowly. "Like people use it to avoid dealing with reality." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, not to confront, but to understand. "And what makes you believe that?" Charlie hesitated. A hesitation that spoke volumes. He wasn't used to being questioned gently. He wasn't used to being heard instead of being challenged. He swallowed. "Because I grew up watching people get hurt because of it. I saw hypocrisy. I saw people pretend to be holy while doing terrible things behind closed doors. It made me angry." The room softened even more. Jonathan didn't defend religion. He didn't correct him. He simply nodded, acknowledging the pain without judgment. "That would make anyone angry," Jonathan said softly. "But someone else's hypocrisy doesn't erase your need for truth. It only makes the journey harder." Charlie looked up, meeting Jonathan's eyes, truly meeting them, and for the first time that night, there wasn't a single trace of competition between them. Only two people sitting across from each other, holding different experiences, yet somehow sharing the same moment. Jonathan continued, "You attacked my faith because you've only seen the broken versions of it. I understand. But not every believer is pretending. Some of us are just trying to love better, live better, be better." A tear formed in the corner of someone's eye in the audience. Others nodded with empathy. Some simply stared, realizing the debate had transformed into something raw and real. Charlie leaned back slowly. He wasn't defeated, he was disarmed. "There's a difference." He glanced at the cameras, aware millions were watching, and for the first time in his career, he didn't care about appearing strong. He just wanted to be honest. "I guess, maybe I've judged too quickly," he said quietly. Jonathan smiled, a small, warm, forgiving smile. "Then today is a good day," he whispered. Charlie let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The host jumped in gently, sensing a moment of closure. "Well, gentlemen, this has been quite a conversation. One I think none of us expected, but maybe one we all needed." The audience clapped softly, not out of excitement, but out of respect. Charlie turned to Jonathan again. "I didn't mean to disrespect you," he said, voice steady but humble. "I thought pushing you would reveal something fake. But it revealed something real. And I wasn't ready for that." Jonathan reached out his hand. "No hard feelings," he said. Charlie looked at the hand of the man he had mocked, belittled, tried to corner, and something inside him shifted. He took it firmly. "Thank you," he whispered. Jonathan nodded. "We're all learning." The cameras captured the handshake that would soon be replayed across every social platform, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human, a moment where pride stepped aside and humility stepped forward. As the show cut to commercial, the room exhaled. Some cried. Some smiled. Some simply sat in silence. But everyone knew one truth. Jonathan didn't win because he argued better. He won because he believed better, not in himself, but in something greater. And in doing so, he didn't just change the conversation. He changed a man. When the cameras cut to commercial, the studio didn't move. No chairs creaked, no producers barked orders, no audience members rushed to whisper their thoughts. It was as if everyone, from the makeup artists to the lighting crew to the viewers sitting at home, needed a moment to process what they had just witnessed. Jonathan Roumie remained seated, calm as ever, hands resting gently on his lap. Charlie Kirk leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring down at his fingers as if searching for answers in the lines of his palms. The host stood up and exhaled heavily, loosening his tie. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "whatever happened here tonight, thank you. For both of you being honest." Honest. That was the word everyone kept returning to. Because what unfolded on live television wasn't scripted, polished, or rehearsed. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even about politics or religion anymore. It had become something far more important. A reminder of what it means to listen. A reminder of what it means to see someone. A reminder of what it means to show respect, even when you don't agree. The audience began to stand, almost instinctively, forming small clusters as they whispered about the moment. A few people approached Jonathan with reverence, not because he was famous, but because they felt they had witnessed something rare. Strength without aggression. Conviction without cruelty. Faith without force. Charlie remained seated, staring ahead as if replaying the last hour in his mind. The cracks in his armor weren't shame or defeat, they were realization. Realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been fighting battles other people weren't responsible for. That his anger toward Faith wasn't actually toward Jonathan, but toward memories, wounds, disappointments he had never dealt with. Jonathan stood and placed a gentle hand on Charlie's shoulder. Not to preach, not to win, but simply to acknowledge him. "Take care of yourself," Jonathan said quietly. "Your heart deserves peace too." Charlie didn't answer. He only nodded, a small, humble gesture filled with more sincerity than any speech he could have given. The crew watched in awe. Rarely did moments like this happen. And even more rarely did they happen live. As viewers tuned back in after commercial break, the host tried to maintain professionalism, but the vulnerability in the room was impossible to hide. He addressed the camera directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight wasn't just a discussion. It was a reminder that disagreements don't have to become destruction. And that sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who chooses kindness over victory." Jonathan smiled gently at the host, then at the audience. No pride. No triumph. Just gratitude. Charlie didn't speak for the rest of the show. Not because he was silenced, but because he was thinking, reflecting, processing. That silence spoke louder than any comeback he could have forced. When the final segment ended, the audience rose in a quiet standing ovation. Not a loud, roaring one, but the kind you give when your heart has been touched rather than entertained. People approached Jonathan as he walked toward the backstage hallway. "Thank you. You really made me think tonight. My family needed to hear that. That was real wisdom." Jonathan didn't claim the praise. He didn't boast. He didn't preach. He simply smiled and said, "God bless you," or "Be kind to one another," or "Take care." Charlie eventually approached Jonathan near the exit. His expression wasn't defensive, arrogant, or angry. It was soft, almost vulnerable. "I meant what I said earlier," Charlie murmured. "I judged you too quickly." Jonathan nodded. "And I forgave you just as quickly." Charlie looked down. "Is it really that simple?" Jonathan answered, "Kindness usually is. People make it complicated." Charlie breathed out slowly, as if something heavy inside him had finally been released. Jonathan placed a hand briefly on his arm. "No matter what you believe or don't believe, you deserve compassion too." And with that, Jonathan walked out of the studio and into the night, calm, peaceful, steady, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they witnessed. Some moments on television are dramatic. Some are controversial. Some go viral for the wrong reasons. But this moment would be remembered because it taught something the world desperately needed. Respect isn't agreement. Kindness isn't weakness. And humility is one of the strongest forms of power. Jonathan didn't win the debate. He didn't humiliate his opponent. He didn't dominate the conversation. He did something far greater. He reminded everyone watching, including Charlie Kirk, that real strength is gentle, real courage is calm, and real faith is lived, not shouted. If you believe humility is true strength, type respect in the comments.